About a month ago, a headline moved faster than the truth. Cameroonian soldiers had crossed into Nigerian territory, and within hours, the internet had already decided what happened. People called it an invasion. They asked where the Nigerian army was. They said Cameroon had gone too far. But the part many people missed was the part that changed the entire story. Those Cameroonian soldiers were not there to occupy Nigeria. They were part of a coordinated operation that helped free hundreds of civilians from terrorist captivity. So the real question is not whether Cameroon invaded Nigeria. The real question is this: why did so many people still see African security through an old map, while the terrorists themselves had already learned how to move beyond it? For years, Boko Haram and other armed groups have understood something very simple. A border can stop an army, but it does not always stop a terrorist. They could strike a village, cross into another country, and disappear behind the legal limits of another state. Soldiers would stop. Paperwork would begin. And by the time permission came, the enemy was gone. But something is changing. Cameroon and Nigeria are now showing that border security in Africa may be entering a new chapter. A chapter where neighboring countries no longer wait for foreign capitals to design their defense. A chapter where African states begin to say, if the threat moves together, then we must also move together. And that is why this story does not really begin in Borno State. It begins 3 years earlier, in the Sahel, when Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger began building a new security logic through the Alliance of Sahel States. Back then, many dismissed it. Some called it dangerous. Some called it unrealistic. Some said leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traore were only speaking in slogans when they argued that Africa needed African solutions to African problems. But now, after Cameroon and Nigeria, the question becomes harder to ignore. Was Traore warning about something the world refused to hear? Was he saying that terrorism could not be defeated, while African countries kept fighting alone behind colonial borders? And are we now watching other nations quietly apply the same principle, stay with me? Because this is not only a story about one rescue mission, it is a story about sovereignty, survival, and the beginning of a new African security mindset. And if this kind of analysis matters to you, follow this channel, because every voice that stays engaged helps Africa's story travel further. For many people, the operation itself was not the biggest surprise. The biggest surprise was seeing Cameroonian soldiers operating inside Nigeria at all. Within minutes, social media was filled with dramatic claims. Some called it a violation of sovereignty. Others demanded to know why a foreign military had crossed an international border. The images spread much faster than the facts, creating the impression that another territorial dispute had suddenly erupted in West Africa. But what happened behind the scenes told a very different story. Only days before the operation, the governments of Cameroon and Nigeria had signed a new memorandum of understanding on defense cooperation. Unlike older agreements that focused mainly on consultation, this framework expanded practical military coordination. It strengthened intelligence sharing, logistics, operational planning, and legal cooperation for dealing with threats that neither country could defeat alone. That legal framework changed everything. Instead of viewing the border as an invisible wall that forced each army to stop, both governments began treating it as a shared security zone where cooperation was essential. When intelligence indicated that hundreds of civilians were being held by terrorist groups near the border, both militaries acted under that agreed framework. The result was a coordinated rescue operation that reportedly freed around 300 civilians from captivity. Yet the public conversation rarely focused on the people who had been rescued. Instead, attention centered on one question: why were Cameroonian soldiers inside Nigeria? Ironically, That question revealed the very problem African governments have been trying to solve for years. Groups such as Boko Haram and the Islamic State West Africa province have never treated national borders as barriers. They recruit across countries, move weapons across countries, and launch attacks wherever security appears weakest. Their fighters know the forests, rivers, and remote communities surrounding Lake Chad far better than any political map ever could. For more than 15 years, this strategy allowed them to survive repeated military campaigns. A unit could attack a village in northeastern Nigeria, seize supplies, abduct civilians, and then disappear across the border into Cameroon. Nigerian troops often had to stop at the frontier because international law limited how far they could pursue without formal authorization. The same problem existed when attacks occurred inside Cameroon, and militants escaped back toward Nigeria. To ordinary villagers living along the border, these invisible lines meant very little. Families shared languages, traded in the same markets, attended the same religious centers, and often had relatives living on both sides. But to terrorist organizations, those same borders became strategic escape routes that repeatedly frustrated national armies. This was never simply a military weakness. It was a structural weakness built into a security system designed for threats that respected borders, not for insurgent groups that deliberately ignored them. And unless that structural gap could be closed, every tactical victory risked becoming temporary. The weakness was never a lack of courage. Nigerian soldiers fought. Cameroonian soldiers fought. Forces from neighboring countries also launched countless operations over the years. Yet despite their efforts, Boko Haram and the Islamic State West Africa province continued to survive because they understood one strategic advantage better than anyone else. They never fought inside a single country. They fought across an entire region. Every time one military increased pressure, the fighters shifted into another jurisdiction. Every successful operation pushed the problem somewhere else instead of eliminating it altogether. That realization became impossible to ignore across the Sahel. By the year 2023, 3 neighboring countries had reached a turning point. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger had all experienced military transitions. They had all spent years battling violent extremist organizations. They had all worked alongside international security partnerships that consumed enormous financial resources but struggled to stop the expansion of insurgent violence. Instead of waiting for another external solution, the 3 governments decided to build one of their own. They created the Alliance of Sahel States, better known as the AES, ICE. At first, many observers dismissed the alliance as little more than a political statement. Critics argued that 3 economically challenged countries facing severe security crises could not possibly reshape regional security. Headlines focused on diplomatic tensions, sanctions, and disagreements with traditional partners. Very few paid attention to the military doctrine that was quietly taking shape. That doctrine introduced one simple but transformative idea. Terrorists should never be able to escape simply because they crossed an international border. The alliance gradually developed a unified security framework that treated the territories of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger as one operational theater against shared extremist threats. Instead of viewing each border as the end of a military mission, commanders increasingly viewed the entire region as one connected battlefield. This did not erase national sovereignty. Each country remained fully independent. Instead, sovereignty was exercised through cooperation rather than isolation. The alliance also moved toward creating a unified force with coordinated command structures, intelligence sharing, logistical support, and joint planning. Decisions could be made faster because participating governments accepted that regional threats required regional responses. Their message became clear. No safe haven. If an armed group attacked inside one member state and attempted to escape into another, the operation would not automatically stop at the border. Whether every aspect of this model succeeds in the long term remains an open question. Security experts continue to debate its effectiveness, sustainability, and political implications. However, one fact is becoming increasingly difficult to overlook. The same strategic logic that emerged inside the Alliance of Sahel States now appears in other parts of Africa. When Cameroon and Nigeria agreed to expand military cooperation across their shared frontier, they were not necessarily copying the AES, but they were embracing the same underlying principle. If terrorists operate across borders, security cannot remain trapped behind them. And that may be the most important shift taking place in Africa today. By now, the similarities are becoming difficult to dismiss. No, Cameroon and Nigeria have not created another alliance of Sahel states. They do not have a unified military headquarters, a permanent multinational force, or a single chain of command like the one being developed by the AES. Their agreement is different in both structure and scope. But when we look beyond the institutions and focus on the strategic thinking behind them, the parallels become remarkably clear. Both approaches begin with the same conclusion. The battlefield no longer ends where the border begins. For decades, African security strategies often treated neighboring countries as separate theaters of operation. Each government defended its own territory. Each military protected its own frontier. Cooperation existed, but it was usually limited by bureaucracy, political hesitation, and complicated approval processes. The new approach challenges that mindset. Instead of asking, whose territory is this, governments are increasingly asking, whose security is at risk? That subtle shift changes everything. The Memorandum of Understanding signed between Cameroon and Nigeria reflects this new philosophy. Intelligence is shared more rapidly. Logistics are coordinated. Joint planning becomes possible before a crisis develops, instead of after lives have already been lost. Most importantly, both governments recognize that defeating a common enemy requires acting together rather than reacting separately. This is precisely why the rescue operation attracted so much attention. It demonstrated that cooperation was no longer limited to meetings between officials or carefully worded diplomatic statements. It had become operational. For ordinary citizens living near the border, that distinction matters far more than political headlines. A farmer does not care which army reaches his village first if both armies arrive to stop terrorists. A mother whose children have been rescued is unlikely to ask whether the soldier wore a Nigerian or Cameroonian uniform. Security, after all, is measured by safety, not by the color of a military flag. This is also where the broader significance of the AES begins to emerge. When the alliance introduced the idea that neighboring countries should treat shared threats as shared responsibilities, many observers viewed it as an experiment limited to the Sahel. Today, similar principles are appearing elsewhere across the continent. Not because governments are copying every institutional detail of the AES, but because they are confronting the same reality. Extremist organizations cooperate across borders. Smugglers cooperate across borders. Illegal arms networks cooperate across borders. If those who create instability operate as regional networks, then stability itself must also become regional. Perhaps this is the strongest evidence that African security thinking is evolving. The map has not changed. The borders remain exactly where they have always been. But the way governments choose to defend those borders is beginning to change. And sometimes, changing the strategy is far more important than changing the map itself. At the center of this conversation stands one man whose name has become impossible to separate from the changing debate over African security. Captain Ibrahim Traore. Supporters describe him as one of the most influential voices behind a new vision of African sovereignty. Critics see him as a controversial military leader whose ideas remain unproven. Regardless of where people stand politically, one fact is difficult to deny. His speeches have forced a growing number of African governments to rethink how security should be organized in the 21st century. It is important to be fair here. Ibrahim Traore did not invent regional cooperation. African countries have worked together on security for decades. Organizations such as the African Union and various regional coalitions have long promoted collective action against terrorism and cross-border crime. What Traore changed was not the existence of cooperation. He changed the urgency behind it. From the beginning of his leadership, he repeatedly argued that Africa could not continue relying primarily on security systems designed, financed, or directed from outside the continent. His message was simple. International partnerships may remain valuable, but Africa must ultimately become responsible for designing and leading its own security architecture. That philosophy became closely associated with a broader principle often summarized as African solutions to African problems. For Traore, this was never presented as an argument against cooperation with the rest of the world. Instead, it was an argument about ownership. Who should define Africa's security priorities? Who should decide how African armies cooperate? Who should build the institutions that respond to African realities? These questions resonated far beyond Burkina Faso. When the Alliance of Sahel States expanded military coordination among Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, many observers focused on its political symbolism. Traore, however, consistently emphasized something more practical. Terrorist organizations do not respect national borders, so African security planning cannot remain confined by those borders either. Now consider what happened between Cameroon and Nigeria. Neither government announced that it was following Ibrahim Traore. Neither government declared that it was copying the Alliance of Sahel States. Yet the operational logic behind their new cooperation reflects many of the same principles Traore has promoted since 2023. Shared intelligence, joint operational planning, legal mechanisms for coordinated action, recognition that neighboring countries face one interconnected security challenge rather than separate national crises. Perhaps this explains why conversations about Traore have changed. 3 years ago, many people dismissed these ideas as political rhetoric. Today, similar approaches are quietly emerging beyond the Sahel. Whether history ultimately judges Ibrahim Traore as a visionary or simply as one important voice in a much larger transformation will depend on what happens over the next decade. But it is becoming increasingly clear that the questions he raised are no longer being ignored. Across Africa, more governments appear willing to ask whether lasting security begins not with stronger borders, but with stronger cooperation across them. As this new security philosophy gains attention, it has also attracted strong criticism, particularly from Western governments, international organizations, and human rights groups. Some of those concerns are legitimate. Others deserve a broader discussion. One of the most common criticisms focuses on the political leadership of the Alliance of Sahel States. Because Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are all governed by military-led transitional authorities, many Western observers argue that regional security cannot be separated from questions of democratic governance. Another concern involves the growing security relationship between some AES members and Russia. Critics warn that replacing one foreign security partner with another does not necessarily strengthen African independence. Instead, they argue, it could simply shift dependence from one global power to another. Human rights organizations have raised additional concerns. Reports have documented civilian casualties during counterterrorism operations in parts of the Sahel. reminding governments that military success should never come at the cost of the people they are sworn to protect. These warnings should not be dismissed. Any security strategy, regardless of who designs it, must remain accountable to the civilians it exists to defend. Yet there is another side of this debate that is often overlooked. For more than a decade, African countries participated in security partnerships supported by powerful international actors. Billions of dollars were invested. Thousands of foreign personnel served across the region. Numerous conferences promised new strategies against violent extremism. Despite those efforts, terrorist violence continued spreading across large areas of the Sahel and the Lake Chad basin. This does not mean every previous initiative failed completely. Many operations saved lives and disrupted extremist networks. But it does explain why many African governments have begun asking an uncomfortable question. If the existing model has not produced lasting security, why should Africa be discouraged from testing a different one? Perhaps this is the real lesson emerging from Cameroon, Nigeria, and the Alliance of Sahel States, AMID. The debate should not be reduced to choosing between East or West, nor should it become a contest between foreign partners. The more important question is who takes primary responsibility for protecting African communities. External cooperation will almost certainly remain necessary. Intelligence sharing, humanitarian assistance, financial support, and diplomatic partnerships all continue to play valuable roles. But ownership matters. Sustainable security is most likely to succeed when neighboring countries trust one another, coordinate their responses, invest in their own institutions, and remain accountable to their own citizens. For other African nations facing similar cross-border threats, the message is becoming increasingly clear. Regional cooperation is no longer simply an option. It may become one of the defining requirements for long-term peace and stability across the continent. When we return to where this story began, the rescue of hundreds of civilians no longer looks like an isolated military operation. It looks like part of a much larger transformation. Only a few years ago, many analysts believed Africa's security future would continue to depend primarily on international coalitions designed outside the continent. Today, a different picture is beginning to emerge. More African governments are exploring partnerships that place regional cooperation, shared responsibility, and local leadership at the center of their security strategies. Cameroon and Nigeria have demonstrated that countries with complicated histories can still find common ground when faced with a common threat. Their cooperation is particularly significant because these are two nations that once stood on opposite sides of one of Africa's most sensitive territorial disputes over the Bakassi Peninsula. That disagreement reached the International Court of Justice and tested diplomatic relations for years. Today, those same countries are coordinating military operations to protect the very communities living along their shared border. That change deserves attention. It reminds us that history does not always determine the future. Sometimes shared challenges become stronger than old disagreements. Whether similar partnerships will continue spreading across West and Central Africa remains uncertain. Political differences, economic pressures, and questions of sovereignty will continue to shape every new agreement. No single memorandum of understanding can eliminate terrorism overnight, and no regional alliance can solve every security problem by itself. Lasting peace will require much more than military cooperation. It will require functioning schools, growing economies, accountable institutions, stronger border communities, and opportunities for young people who might otherwise be drawn toward violent extremist groups. Security creates the space for those investments to succeed. Without security, development struggles to take root. Perhaps that is why the conversation surrounding Captain Ibrahim Traore has become larger than one individual or one country, whether people agree with all of his policies or not. The broader debate he helped energize continues to influence discussions across the continent. The idea that African nations should design stronger regional solutions for African security challenges is no longer confined to speeches. It is increasingly appearing in practical agreements between neighboring states that may ultimately become the most important legacy of this moment. Not the rise of one leader, not the success of one alliance, but the gradual emergence of a more confident and cooperative Africa, an Africa that believes regional unity can strengthen national sovereignty instead of weakening it, an Africa that sees Pan-African cooperation not as an idealistic slogan, but as a practical strategy for protecting lives, rebuilding border communities, and creating long-term stability. Whether through the African Union, future regional partnerships, or continued cooperation inspired by the experiences of Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Nigeria, and Captain Ibrahim Traore. The next chapter of Africa's security story will almost certainly be written by Africans themselves. If this discussion has given you a new perspective on Africa, new Pan-Africanism, Captain Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso, the African Union, and the future of Pan-African cooperation, share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective is part of this conversation, and if you enjoy thoughtful analysis that looks beyond the headlines, subscribe to the channel and join us again for the next story. The explosions did not shock the Sahel. What shocked the region was how fast everything happened. Within hours of coordinated attacks in northern Mali, warplanes linked to the Alliance of Sahel States moved into action. Targets were identified, airspace was coordinated, intelligence was shared, and for the first time, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger responded not like three separate governments, but like one military structure operating across borders. That is the real story. For years, the Sahel was known for fragmented responses, delayed operations, and international missions that often struggled to react quickly enough to fast-moving insurgent groups. Armed factions learned how to exploit borders, bureaucracy, and hesitation. They survived by moving faster than governments could coordinate. But now something appears to be changing. The Alliance of Sahel States, also known as AES, is beginning to act with a level of coordination that many observers did not expect to see this quickly. And whether people support or oppose these governments, one fact is becoming difficult to ignore. The military landscape of the Sahel may be entering an entirely new phase. This is no longer only about isolated counter-terrorism operations. It is about the possible birth of a regional military system built and controlled inside Africa itself. And that possibility is making many actors nervous. Because if AES can sustain this level of coordination, the balance of security power in West Africa could slowly begin to shift away from older international models and toward a new regional structure driven directly by Sahel states themselves. For the first time in many years, some Africans are asking a different question, not whether outside powers will stabilize the Sahel, but whether the Sahel is preparing to stabilize itself. If you follow Africa's changing future, subscribe, because what is happening now may reshape the continent for decades. At the beginning, many observers viewed the Alliance of Sahel States as mostly political. A declaration, a message of resistance, a symbolic partnership between Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, after growing tensions with ECOWAS, France, and several Western security structures. But recent events suggest that AES is becoming something very different. What the region is now witnessing is not simply diplomatic coordination. It is the early formation of a functioning military framework capable of acting across borders with shared objectives and synchronized timing. That distinction matters enormously. For decades, Security operations in the Sahel were usually handled country by country. Even when neighboring states faced the same insurgent threats, military responses often remained fragmented. Intelligence moved slowly. Operations required separate approvals. Coordination was limited. Armed groups learned how to exploit those gaps. AES appears to be trying to eliminate them. The recent air operations demonstrated several things at once. Intelligence was shared quickly. Airspace coordination was possible between multiple governments. Decisions were made rapidly, and military pressure was applied almost simultaneously. That is no longer symbolic cooperation. That is operational coordination. And once a regional alliance reaches that stage, the strategic environment begins to change. Because enemies are no longer calculating the response of a single nation. They are calculating the possible response of an entire regional bloc acting together. That creates a very different kind of pressure. For armed groups operating across the Sahel, borders once created breathing room. Fighters could relocate. Networks could reorganize. Delays between governments created time. But if AES continues functioning this way, those gaps may begin to shrink. And that may be the most important military development the Sahel has seen in years. The most dangerous advantage in modern conflict is not always firepower. Sometimes it is speed. And that may be exactly what the Alliance of Sahel States is trying to build. The recent military response inside Mali was not remarkable only because airstrikes happened. Airstrikes happen in many conflicts around the world. What made this situation different was the timeline. Operations reportedly began within hours after coordinated attacks in the north. That level of reaction does not happen through improvisation. It suggests that communication systems were already active. Intelligence channels were already functioning. Military leadership already understood who would respond, how they would respond, and how quickly decisions could be approved. That changes everything. For years, one of the biggest weaknesses in Sahel security operations was delay. Information often moved through multiple bureaucratic layers before action was taken. By the time responses were organized, armed groups had already relocated or disappeared into border regions. AES appears to be attempting a completely different model. Instead of waiting for slow international coordination, decisions are being pushed closer to the battlefield itself. And in asymmetric warfare, that can become a massive strategic advantage. Because insurgent groups survive through mobility, they rely on time. Time to escape. Time to reorganize. Time to exploit confusion between neighboring states. But when three governments coordinate rapidly, those windows begin to close. This is why the speed of the response matters more than the number of aircraft involved. It signals the existence of a structure capable of immediate action. And for many Africans watching the Sahel, this feels historically important. For the first time in a long time, regional security decisions appear to be happening inside the region itself, shaped by governments facing the threat directly, instead of distant international systems operating far from the battlefield. The growing coordination inside the Alliance of Sahel States is not only changing military calculations, it is also creating anxiety among armed groups, regional rivals, and even some international powers watching the region closely. Because the real fear is not one successful operation. The real fear is what happens if this becomes normal. For years, many insurgent groups survived by exploiting geography. Borders across the Sahel were often difficult to control. Fighters could move between remote regions, reorganize networks, and avoid concentrated military pressure by crossing from one national territory into another. That environment created flexibility. But a coordinated AES changes that equation. If Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger begin operating as a synchronized security space, movement becomes more dangerous for armed factions. Pressure can emerge from multiple directions at the same time. Escape routes become less predictable. Delays become shorter, and uncertainty begins to grow for groups that once relied on fragmented government responses. That is why reactions from Tuareg separatist groups were immediate and highly focused on the involvement of Burkina Faso and Niger, because their participation changes the battlefield itself. But concern is not limited to insurgent groups alone. International observers are also paying close attention because AES represents something larger than counterterrorism operations. It represents the possibility of a regional military structure developing outside many traditional Western-led security frameworks. And that possibility carries geopolitical consequences. If AES succeeds in sustaining rapid coordination, some countries may begin asking difficult questions about the future role of older international security models in Africa. That is why this moment matters beyond Mali. It touches the broader balance of influence inside West Africa itself. The concern now is not whether AES can launch one operation. The concern is whether it is building a military system capable of repeating this kind of response again and again under growing pressure. No figure represents the new political mood inside the Sahel more strongly than Captain Ibrahim Traore. To many supporters across Africa, he symbolizes a generation that no longer wants the continent's security future designed somewhere else. His speeches, public image, and political messaging consistently focus on sovereignty, self-reliance, and the idea that African nations must develop the ability to defend themselves without permanent dependence on outside powers. That message connects deeply inside the Sahel. Because for many people in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, years of international military involvement did not bring the level of stability they had hoped for. Violence expanded. Armed groups adapted. Entire communities continued to live under insecurity. As frustration grew, leaders like Ibrahim Traore began presenting a different vision, a vision where African states cooperate directly with one another, share intelligence, coordinate military action, and respond to threats using structures controlled inside the region itself. That is one reason the Alliance of Sahel States carries emotional weight far beyond military strategy. To supporters, AES is not simply a security pact. It represents dignity, independence, and the belief that African nations should have the power to make urgent security decisions without waiting for approval from distant capitals. This is also why Pan-Africanism has become closely connected to the image of AES. Many young Africans now see the alliance as proof that regional cooperation can move beyond speeches and become operational reality. But there is also an important counter-argument. Symbols alone cannot stabilize a region. Strong speeches cannot replace logistics, training, intelligence networks, or economic resilience. If security conditions fail to improve over time, public enthusiasm could face serious pressure. And that may become the greatest challenge facing Ibrahim Traore and the broader AES project. Inspiration can unite people, but only long-term results can transform a powerful symbol into lasting history. The rise of the Alliance of Sahel States has triggered mixed reactions far beyond West Africa. Supporters describe AES as a necessary step toward African security independence. Critics, especially in parts of the Western political and media landscape, see something far more concerning. One major criticism focuses on military rule. Western governments and international organizations have repeatedly warned that prolonged military leadership could weaken democratic institutions inside Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Others fear that intensified regional military operations could increase instability or create new humanitarian risks if conflicts continue expanding across borders. There is also a strategic concern beneath the political language. For decades, security policy in the Sahel involved heavy international influence through military partnerships, intelligence support, and foreign deployments. But AES is attempting to build a regional security system that answers primarily to Sahel governments themselves. And that shift could gradually reduce outside influence in one of Africa's most strategically important regions. However, many people inside the Sahel present a different argument. They point out that despite years of international operations, insecurity continued spreading across large parts of the region. Armed groups became more organized, civilian displacement increased, and public frustration slowly grew. For many citizens, AES did not emerge because people rejected cooperation with the outside world. It emerged because confidence in older security models had weakened. That distinction is important. This is not simply a military disagreement between Africa and the West. It is also a debate about who should control security decisions inside African territories. And there may be lessons here for other African nations. The first lesson is that regional cooperation matters. Armed groups move across borders, so intelligence and military coordination may also need to cross borders. The second lesson is that speed matters as much as weapons. Delayed decisions can become strategic weaknesses. But there is also a final lesson. Sovereignty cannot survive on emotion alone. Any nation seeking true security independence must still build strong institutions, logistics, communication systems, and long-term economic stability. Whether the Alliance of Sahel States succeeds or fails will not be decided by one operation. History is shaped by repetition. Right now, AES has demonstrated something important. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have shown they can coordinate military action quickly, share operational responsibilities, and respond to threats with a level of synchronization many observers did not expect this soon. That alone is already changing perceptions across the Sahel. Because once a regional military structure proves it can function in real time, expectations begin to rise. Governments study it, armed groups adapt to it, foreign powers begin recalculating their influence in West Africa. But the real test is only beginning. Maintaining rapid coordination under long-term pressure is far harder than achieving it once. Over time, every alliance faces strain. Logistics become difficult, economic pressure grows, political priorities can slowly diverge. That is where military alliances either evolve into stable systems or begin to fracture. Still, many Africans are watching this moment with cautious optimism. For decades, African security discussions often centered around dependency and foreign intervention. AES is trying to present another vision, a vision where regional states cooperate directly, build military capability together, and define security priorities from inside Africa itself. Whether that vision succeeds remains uncertain, but its symbolic importance is already undeniable. Across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, supporters increasingly connect this moment to Pan-African hopes for a more independent future. Many believe Africa New must eventually include African control over African security decisions. That is why figures like Captain Ibrahim Traore have become closely linked to this movement. The African Union and neighboring states are watching carefully because the outcome may influence future regional alliances across the continent. If Pan-Africanism can move from speeches into real coordination, Ibrahim Traore and the AES alliance may reshape how the world sees African power in the Sahel. If you believe Africa is entering a new chapter, subscribe and stay with us because the story of the Sahel is only beginning. When Somalia's Interior Security Minister arrived in Ouagadougou to meet Captain Ibrahim Traore, Many people outside Africa saw it as just another diplomatic visit. But across the continent, the message felt much bigger. A nation that has spent years fighting terrorism was now looking toward Burkina Faso for answers. That alone surprised many observers. For decades, African countries facing insurgencies usually turned first to France, the United States, or international military coalitions. Yet today, some leaders are beginning to look toward another African nation instead, a country once described only through poverty, instability, and violence is suddenly being discussed as a possible model of resistance and security cooperation. Why? Why would Somalia, a nation that has battled al-Shabaab for years, seek closer security ties with Burkina Faso? The answer may reveal a major shift happening inside Africa itself. Under Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso is trying to build something different. Not simply another military campaign against terrorism, but a broader vision based on self-reliance, national dignity, and African-led security cooperation. Supporters believe he is helping Africa rediscover confidence in its own strength after decades of dependency on outside powers. And that is exactly why this story matters far beyond Burkina Faso. Because the real question is no longer whether terrorism exists in Africa. The real question is who Africans now trust to fight it. If you enjoy deep stories about Africa's changing future, remember to subscribe because this channel follows the leaders, movements, and turning points reshaping the continent today. Somalia's visit to Burkina Faso was not symbolic theater. It reflected a growing belief that Ouagadougou may now represent something many African nations have been searching for: a homegrown response to insecurity. The visit from Somalia also carried another message that many international observers immediately understood. Burkina Faso was no longer being treated only as a country in crisis. It was beginning to be viewed as a security partner. Somalia and Burkina Faso share painful similarities. Both nations have spent years fighting extremist groups that attack villages, destroy schools, displace families, and weaken local economies. In both countries, terrorism has become more than a military issue. It has become part of everyday life. For ordinary citizens, the consequences are devastating. Farmers abandon their fields because armed groups control rural roads. Parents fear sending children to school. Entire communities are forced to flee with almost nothing. In many areas, survival itself becomes uncertain. That is why the meeting between Somali officials and Ibrahim Traore mattered so much. Somalia was not simply looking for diplomatic friendship, it was looking for practical cooperation in intelligence sharing, security training, and counterterrorism coordination. And perhaps most importantly, Somalia was looking at a country trying to fight back without depending entirely on foreign military structures. This growing interest in Burkina Faso also reflects frustration across parts of Africa. For years, Western powers promised stability in the Sahel through military operations, foreign bases, and counterterrorism missions. Yet, violence continued spreading across borders. Many Africans began asking difficult questions. If thousands of foreign troops, advanced technology, and international funding could not stop the crisis after so many years, then what exactly needed to change? That question would eventually help transform Ibrahim Traore from a national military leader into a continental political symbol. Across the Sahel, frustration toward Western military strategy did not appear overnight. France maintained a military presence in parts of West Africa for years. The United States also invested heavily in intelligence operations, surveillance programs, and counterterrorism support across the region. But despite all of this, insecurity often became worse instead of better. Armed groups expanded into rural territories. Attacks spread across borders, millions of civilians were displaced. In some communities, people began feeling that foreign intervention had become permanent, while peace remained temporary. This growing anger fueled massive anti-French demonstrations in countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Protesters waved national flags and demanded greater sovereignty over security decisions. Many no longer wanted outside powers deciding the future of African nations. Still, the situation is more complicated than simple slogans. Not every failure can be blamed on Western countries alone. The Sahel crisis is also connected to poverty, corruption, weak state institutions, ethnic tensions, illegal arms trafficking, and decades of political instability. Even the strongest military operation struggles when these deeper problems remain unresolved. That is why Ibrahim Traore's message resonates with many Africans. He argues that security cannot depend only on foreign soldiers or military equipment. A nation must rebuild confidence inside its own population. Citizens must believe they are defending their own homeland, not serving outside interests. For supporters, this is what makes Burkina Faso different. The country is attempting to reconnect national security with national identity itself. And for many Africans watching from outside Burkina Faso, that idea feels more powerful than any foreign speech about stabilization. Instead of waiting for outside armies to solve the crisis, Ibrahim Traore began promoting a different strategy. His government focused on building local resistance networks, strengthening cooperation with neighboring Sahel states, and involving ordinary citizens in national defense. One of the most important parts of this strategy was the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland program. Thousands of civilians received training to help protect villages and support national security forces. Supporters viewed the program as proof that Burkina Faso was trying to transform the entire population into a force capable of resisting terrorism. To many citizens, this approach restored something they felt had been disappearing for years: national pride. Traore also pushed for stronger regional alliances. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger created the Alliance of Sahel States, often called AES. Together, these countries began discussing intelligence sharing, joint military coordination, and a collective response to extremist violence spreading across the region. This was not just military cooperation, it was also political symbolism. For decades, many African security systems relied heavily on outside funding, foreign military advisors, and international operations. AES represented an attempt to build an African-centered security structure controlled primarily by African governments themselves. Traore repeatedly argued that terrorism cannot be defeated by weapons alone. According to his vision, security must also include food production, economic independence, and stronger local communities. A hungry and desperate population is easier for extremist groups to exploit. That message connected deeply with many ordinary Africans. For them, the fight against terrorism is not only about soldiers on battlefields, it is also about whether families can farm safely, children can attend school, and entire communities can live without fear again. As Ibrahim Traore's influence grew, many Africans began comparing him to Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader who once transformed Burkina Faso into a symbol of African dignity and self-reliance. The comparison is emotional more than political, but it reveals how strongly Traore's image resonates across the continent. He is young, direct, and openly speaks about sovereignty, national pride, and resistance to dependency. In an era when many African citizens feel disappointed by traditional political elites, Traore appears different. To supporters, he looks like a leader, willing to confront pressures that others avoided for decades. This explains why his speeches spread rapidly across African social media platforms. Many young Africans see him as part of a new Pan-African generation. A generation that believes Africa should control its own resources, secure its own borders, and define its own political future without constant outside direction. Still, admiration alone does not solve Burkina Faso's problems. The country continues facing deadly attacks, humanitarian crises, and economic hardship. Large parts of the population remain vulnerable, and security challenges are far from over. Critics argue that strong rhetoric and military mobilization may not guarantee long-term stability. But even critics admit something important. Traore has changed the conversation. Before, many African nations were discussed mainly as victims waiting for foreign intervention. Now, Burkina Faso is attempting to present itself differently, not as a helpless state, but as a country trying to organize its own survival on its own terms. That shift may explain why some Western governments view the growing popularity of Ibrahim Traore with concern. Because if more African nations begin embracing this model of political and security independence, the balance of influence across the continent could change dramatically. Western criticism toward Burkina Faso often focuses on democracy, military governance, and human rights concerns. Some international observers argue that relying too heavily on military structures could weaken civilian institutions over time. Others worry that anti-Western sentiment may isolate countries like Burkina Faso from global partnerships and financial support. These concerns are real and cannot simply be ignored. But supporters of Ibrahim Traore answer with a different question. What should a country do when decades of foreign-backed security strategies fail to stop terrorism? For many citizens in the Sahel, this debate is no longer theoretical. It is personal. Entire generations have grown up surrounded by violence, instability, and uncertainty. In their eyes, waiting for the same solutions to suddenly produce different results no longer makes sense. This is why Traore's message continues spreading beyond Burkina Faso. He represents the belief that African nations should at least have the right to attempt their own path, even if that path carries risks and challenges. To many supporters, sovereignty means little if security decisions are still shaped mostly outside the continent. Somalia's outreach to Burkina Faso may therefore represent something much larger than bilateral cooperation. It may signal the beginning of a broader shift toward African-led security partnerships built on shared experience rather than external supervision. For other African countries, the lesson is becoming harder to ignore. No nation can protect itself permanently if its people feel disconnected from the state, dependent on outside protection, or excluded from national purpose. Security is not only about weapons, it is also about identity, trust, dignity, and belief in a shared future. Somalia's decision to turn toward Burkina Faso may one day be remembered as more than a diplomatic event. It may represent a moment when parts of Africa quietly began changing the direction of their future. Burkina Faso has not defeated terrorism. The country still faces painful losses, dangerous attacks, and enormous economic pressure. But what makes Captain Ibrahim Traore impossible to ignore is not the claim of total victory. It is the determination to pursue a different vision while under pressure from every direction. For many Africans, that determination carries emotional weight. A small nation once viewed mainly through the lens of crisis is now trying to inspire a broader continental movement based on sovereignty, resilience, and cooperation between African states themselves. Somalia's outreach to Ouagadougou reflects growing recognition that African nations may need to rely more on each other in the years ahead. That idea is becoming central to a new wave of Pan-African thinking. In this Africa new generation, security is no longer seen only as a matter of foreign alliances or military hardware. It is tied to dignity, identity, economic survival, and the belief that African people deserve control over their own destiny. Whether people support or criticize Ibrahim Traore, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. He has already changed the conversation inside Africa. Today, Burkina Faso stands at the center of debates about sovereignty, resistance, and the future role of the African Union in protecting the continent from instability and foreign dependency. And for many supporters of Pan-Africanism, Captain Ibrahim Traore has become a symbol of a continent searching for confidence in itself again. Do you believe Ibrahim Traore's model could inspire other African nations? Or will Burkina Faso face the same struggles that challenged previous movements for independence and self-reliance? Share your thoughts below. And subscribe for more deep stories about Africa, Burkina Faso, and the leaders shaping the continent's future. A devastating JNIM assault on 2 military bases in northern Benin has sent shockwaves across West Africa and reignited a debate that many leaders had hoped to avoid. Despite years of international security cooperation, military training programs, intelligence partnerships, and foreign assistance, heavily armed militants were still able to launch a coordinated attack that inflicted significant damage and raised serious questions about the effectiveness of existing security strategies. For many observers, this was not simply another terrorist incident. It was a warning signal. It was a reminder that the security crisis that once seemed concentrated in the Sahel is steadily moving southward, threatening countries that previously believed they were protected by geography, diplomacy, or international partnerships. Today, we examine why this attack has become much more than a military event. We will explore how the rise of the Alliance of Sahel States, known as AES, has reshaped regional thinking about security, why the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traore continues to attract attention across Africa, and whether Benin may eventually need closer cooperation with its northern neighbors to confront a growing threat. If you value in-depth African geopolitical analysis grounded in facts, history, and real developments on the ground, make sure you subscribe and join our growing community. The attack itself immediately captured regional attention because of its scale and organization. Reports indicated that hundreds of militants associated with JNIM participated in operations targeting military positions in northern Benin. The attackers reportedly conducted surveillance, coordinated their movements, and launched a highly organized assault that overwhelmed local defenses. The significance of the attack extends beyond the immediate casualties and material losses. For years, security analysts warned that extremist groups operating in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger would eventually seek to expand toward coastal West African nations. What many feared is now becoming reality. Benin has increasingly found itself on the front line of a conflict that was once viewed as a distant problem. The country's northern regions share strategic connections with areas that have experienced prolonged instability, making them vulnerable to infiltration and cross-border attacks. Perhaps the most important consequence of this incident is the conversation it has sparked. Across West Africa, policymakers, military officers, and ordinary citizens are asking difficult questions. If heavily supported security systems can still be breached, what adjustments are necessary? If terrorism continues to spread despite years of international involvement, should countries begin exploring alternative approaches? These questions have placed the experiences of Burkina Faso, Mali, and the broader AES alliance under renewed scrutiny. Whether one agrees with their policies or not, their efforts have become impossible to ignore, and the attack on Benin has only intensified that discussion. The expansion of terrorism across West Africa did not happen overnight. It is the result of years of shifting battlefields, evolving militant strategies, and changing regional dynamics. What is happening in Benin today mirrors a pattern that security experts have been warning about for a long time. For years, Janim concentrated much of its activity in Mali, Burkina Faso, and parts of Niger. These areas became the center of the regional counterterrorism struggle. However, as military pressure increased in certain zones, extremist groups began looking for new opportunities beyond their traditional strongholds. This is one reason many analysts believe terrorism is gradually moving south. Militants understand that borders in West Africa are often difficult to secure. They exploit remote terrain, isolated communities, and gaps in regional coordination. As a result, countries that were once considered relatively insulated from the worst violence are now facing growing risks. Benin has become one of the clearest examples of this shift. Its northern territories sit near regions that have experienced years of instability. What once seemed like a distant security challenge has increasingly become a domestic concern. The recent attack demonstrated that the threat is no longer approaching. It has already arrived. The implications extend beyond Benin. Neighboring countries such as Togo and Ghana are also paying close attention to these developments. If extremist groups continue expanding toward coastal West Africa, the entire security landscape of the region could change dramatically. This reality has strengthened calls for deeper regional cooperation. Terrorist organizations do not respect national borders. They move where opportunities exist. Therefore, many observers argue that security responses must become just as flexible and coordinated. The attack on Benin serves as a powerful reminder that no country can afford to view itself in isolation. The future stability of West Africa may depend on how effectively nations work together against a threat that increasingly affects them all. The creation of the Alliance of Sahel States marked one of the most significant geopolitical developments in modern West African history. Formed by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the alliance emerged during a period when all three countries faced severe security threats and growing frustration with existing regional arrangements. At its core, the AES was designed around a simple idea. An attack against one member should be viewed as a challenge to all members. Rather than addressing terrorism as separate national problems, the alliance seeks to approach security as a shared regional responsibility. This philosophy represents an important departure from older models. For many years, security cooperation often depended heavily on external partnerships, international missions, and outside support. While those efforts achieved some successes, many communities across the Sahel continued to experience violence, displacement, and instability. The AES leadership argues that countries facing the same threat should coordinate more directly with one another. This includes improving intelligence sharing, increasing military communication, and strengthening the ability to respond rapidly to cross-border movements by armed groups. One of the most important aspects of the AES model is its emphasis on regional ownership. Leaders within the alliance frequently stress that security decisions should be guided primarily by local realities rather than distant priorities. Supporters believe this approach allows governments to react more quickly and design strategies that better reflect conditions on the ground. The recent attack in Benin has renewed interest in this model. As extremist groups continue to operate across national borders, many observers are asking whether stronger cooperation between countries facing similar threats could improve overall security outcomes. The AES does not claim to have solved every challenge confronting the Sahel. Terrorism remains a serious concern throughout the region. However, the alliance has introduced a framework that many Africans view as an attempt to build security capacity from within, rather than relying exclusively on external actors. That idea continues to attract attention as countries search for effective ways to protect their people and defend their sovereignty. To understand why Ibrahim Traore has become one of the most discussed leaders in Africa, it is necessary to look beyond military operations and focus on the broader philosophy that guides his leadership. For Traore, security is not simply about defeating armed groups. It is about rebuilding a nation in a way that reduces the conditions that allow instability to grow in the first place. Since coming to power, he has repeatedly emphasized that military victories alone cannot guarantee long-term peace. A country must also strengthen its economy, expand opportunities for its citizens, and reduce dependence on external actors. This perspective has become a central theme in Burkina Faso's national conversation, and a major reason why his influence extends far beyond his country's borders. Supporters argue that Traore represents a new generation of African leadership focused on sovereignty, self-reliance, and national dignity. His speeches often connect security, economic development, and political independence as parts of the same challenge. According to this view, a nation that cannot feed itself, develop its industries, or control its resources will always face vulnerabilities regardless of how strong its military may become. This philosophy has resonated with many people across West Africa. In countries such as Benin, Togo, Ghana, and Senegal, growing numbers of citizens follow developments in Burkina Faso with interest. Some see Traore as a symbol of African self-determination. Others remain cautious but acknowledge that his message has sparked important discussions about the future direction of the continent. The recent attack in Benin has added new relevance to these debates. As governments search for effective responses to expanding security threats, many observers are examining not only military strategies but also the broader ideas that shape them. In that context, Traore's emphasis on linking security with development continues to attract attention. Whether one agrees with all of his policies or not, his impact on regional political discourse is undeniable, and he has helped shift the conversation from dependence toward self-reliance and from reaction toward long-term national resilience. That influence may continue to grow as West Africa confronts increasingly complex security challenges. While the recent attack in Benin has drawn international attention, many observers have also focused on developments inside Burkina Faso and Mali. These two countries remain at the center of the regional struggle against extremist groups, and their experiences provide important context for understanding the broader security debate. In Burkina Faso, the government has pursued a strategy that combines military operations with efforts to strengthen national self-reliance. Security remains a major challenge, and no serious observer would claim that all problems have been solved. However, supporters of the current approach point to several developments that they believe demonstrate progress. Military authorities have expanded local defense initiatives, increased recruitment efforts, and sought to improve coordination between national forces and communities. At the same time, the government has promoted programs designed to increase domestic production, strengthen agriculture, and encourage greater economic independence. The underlying idea is that security and development must advance together. Mali presents a similar picture of determination mixed with ongoing challenges. The Malian armed forces, commonly known as FAMA, continue to play a central role in operations against JNM and other armed groups. Military pressure has remained intense across multiple regions, particularly in areas that have long served as centers of insurgent activity. Supporters of the AES approach argue that sustained military pressure has made it more difficult for extremist groups to operate freely in some locations. Critics counter that significant threats remain and that stability has not yet been fully restored. Both observations can be true at the same time. What makes the experiences of Burkina Faso and Mali particularly relevant for Benin is not the claim of perfect success. Rather, It is the willingness of these countries to experiment with a model that links security cooperation, national sovereignty, and economic self-reliance. As Benin evaluates its own future strategy, the lessons emerging from its northern neighbors may become increasingly difficult to ignore. The rise of the Alliance of Sahel States has not been welcomed by everyone across Europe, North America, and within certain international institutions. Concerns have been raised about the direction taken by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Critics frequently point to issues involving governance, political transitions, press freedom, and human rights. Others argue that the withdrawal of AES members from ECOWAS risks creating new divisions within West Africa. These concerns are part of an important debate and should not be dismissed outright. Every government, regardless of its political system, should remain accountable to its citizens and strive to protect fundamental rights. However, supporters of the AES model present a different perspective. They argue that many of the security problems facing the Sahel developed during years when foreign military partnerships were already deeply involved in the region. From this viewpoint, it is reasonable for African nations to explore alternative strategies when previous approaches failed to deliver lasting stability. Supporters also emphasize that ordinary citizens often judge policies by practical outcomes rather than political theories alone. They ask whether communities are becoming safer, whether economic opportunities are improving, and whether governments are strengthening their ability to protect national sovereignty. The debate surrounding AES ultimately reflects a larger question facing Africa. Should security strategies continue to depend primarily on external frameworks? Or should African nations assume greater responsibility for designing solutions tailored to local realities? As events in Benin demonstrate, this discussion is no longer theoretical. It is increasingly tied to urgent questions of security, stability, and the future direction of the continent. The attack on Benin has created a moment of reflection not only for one country, but for the entire African continent. The central question is no longer whether the security threat is expanding. The evidence suggests that it is. The more important question is how nations choose to respond. Benin now stands at a strategic crossroads. It can continue relying primarily on existing security frameworks, strengthen bilateral partnerships, or deepen practical cooperation with neighboring countries that confront the same threats every day. Whatever path is chosen, the recent attack has demonstrated that security challenges can no longer be viewed through a purely national lens. The broader lesson for Africa is equally important. Long-term stability requires more than military strength alone. It requires regional cooperation, economic resilience, accountable leadership, and the ability to address the root causes of instability. These principles are increasingly shaping discussions across the continent. As Africa continues to evolve, the ideas of Pan-African cooperation, Burkina Faso, Africa New, Captain Ibrahim Traore, the African Union, Pan-Africanism, and Ibrahim Traore will remain at the center of important conversations shaping the continent's future. If you enjoyed this analysis, subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and stay with us for more in-depth coverage of the developments transforming Africa today. West Africa is shaking under the weight of terrorism, military coups, collapsing public trust, and growing anger toward the old foreign powers that once claimed they could stabilize the region. Across the Sahel, entire communities are living between fear and uncertainty, while governments struggle to stop armed groups from expanding deeper into African territory. Yet, in the middle of this dangerous crisis, something unexpected just happened. ECOWAS, the same regional bloc that once tried to isolate Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, has now sent a special envoy directly to Captain Ibrahim Traore and the Alliance of Sahel States. This meeting was not an ordinary diplomatic visit. For many Africans, it was a sign that the balance of power in West Africa is changing faster than anyone expected. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are no longer acting like isolated military governments under pressure. Instead, they are building a new security alliance, tightening borders, launching military operations, and openly challenging the old geopolitical order that dominated the region for decades. At the same time, many ECOWAS countries remain trapped in instability, political division, and worsening insecurity. That reality is forcing difficult questions across Africa. Is the AES becoming a new model for African sovereignty and self-defense? Has the old system already begun to lose control of West Africa? If you believe Africa is entering a new era of sovereignty and resistance, make sure you subscribe and stay with us until the very end. For years, ECOWAS positioned itself as the main authority in West Africa. After the military takeovers in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the organization responded with sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and threats of isolation. Many international observers expected the AES countries to collapse under economic and political pressure. But that never happened. Across the Sahel, terrorism is no longer an isolated crisis, hidden in remote desert regions. It has become a growing wave of instability threatening the entire future of West Africa. Armed groups linked to JNYM, ISGS, Boko Haram, and other extremist networks continue to move across borders with deadly flexibility. Entire villages have been attacked. Thousands of families have been displaced. In many rural communities, people no longer ask whether violence will arrive. They ask when. One of the biggest fears inside the AES today is that weak border control allowed terrorist networks to spread for years without serious resistance. Vast desert routes connecting Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Libya, and northern Nigeria became corridors for weapons trafficking, fuel smuggling, and militant movement. According to many security analysts in the region, open borders without strong security coordination created dangerous vulnerabilities that armed groups exploited repeatedly. This is why Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have dramatically changed their approach. Instead of waiting for international missions or foreign coalitions to secure their territory, the AES governments are increasing military patrols, tightening border checks, expanding intelligence cooperation, and launching more aggressive counterterrorism operations. At the same time, the crisis is spreading beyond the Sahel itself. Countries like Benin and Togo are now facing increasing security threats near their northern borders. Coastal West Africa is beginning to realize that the instability consuming the Sahel could eventually move southward if the region remains divided and weak. For ordinary African families, these geopolitical debates are deeply personal. Parents want children who can safely attend school. Farmers want to work without fear of armed attacks. Traders want roads free from kidnappings and ambushes. In the eyes of many citizens, survival matters more than political slogans. For decades, many Africans were told that Western military partnerships and foreign intervention would eventually bring peace to the Sahel. Foreign bases expanded across the region. International counterterrorism missions operated for years. Billions of dollars were spent in the name of stabilization. Yet, despite all those promises, insecurity continued to spread across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. This growing frustration created a deep crisis of confidence among ordinary citizens. Across many African communities, people started asking difficult questions. If foreign military operations were successful, why were terrorist groups becoming stronger? Why were villages still falling under attack? Why were young Africans still dying while foreign powers claimed to be protecting the region? That frustration opened the door for the rise of the AES. Unlike the older political structures tied closely to foreign influence, the Alliance of Sahel States presented itself as something different. It promoted the idea that Africans must defend Africa with their own strength, their own military cooperation, and their own political decisions. For many citizens, that message carried enormous emotional power. The return of Pan-African sentiment has become impossible to ignore. Across social media platforms, radio discussions, and political debates, growing numbers of Africans are expressing support for leaders who openly challenge foreign pressure and demand greater sovereignty. To many supporters, the AES is no longer viewed simply as a military alliance. It is becoming a symbol of resistance, dignity, and self-determination. This does not mean every African fully supports the policies of the AES governments, but many people clearly believe that the old system failed to provide security, stability, or respect for African sovereignty. That belief alone is already reshaping political conversations across West Africa. Among the leaders emerging from the political transformation of the Sahel, Captain Ibrahim Traore has become the most recognized figure across West Africa. To his supporters, he represents a new generation of African leadership that refuses to accept foreign pressure, insecurity, and dependency as permanent realities. To his critics, he represents the growing influence of military rule in regional politics. But regardless of opinion, Ibrahim Traore has already changed the political conversation inside Africa. Unlike many traditional politicians, Traore built his image around military discipline, sovereignty, and direct involvement in the security crisis affecting ordinary citizens. He often appears in military uniform alongside soldiers rather than inside luxurious political settings. That image resonates strongly with many Africans who believe older political elites failed to protect the population from terrorism, corruption, and instability. For supporters of the AES, Traore symbolizes resistance against dependency. His speeches regularly emphasize that Africa must defend its own territory, protect its own resources, and build military strength without relying entirely on foreign powers. Across social media platforms, his popularity has spread far beyond Burkina Faso. Many young Africans now see him as part of a broader Pan-African movement focused on dignity, sovereignty, and self-respect. At the same time, Western governments and international organizations remain concerned about the direction of the AES. Critics argue that military governments could weaken democratic institutions and normalize coups as political solutions. Some analysts also warn that military success alone cannot solve the economic and social problems damaging the Sahel. However, many citizens inside Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger respond with a different argument. They believe security must come first before political reforms can truly succeed. In their eyes, any government that cannot protect roads, villages, and families eventually loses legitimacy. That is why the recent meeting between ECOWAS and Ibrahim Traore carried enormous symbolic importance. Not long ago, the AES leadership was treated as isolated. Today, ECOWAS itself is seeking dialogue, showing that the balance of power in West Africa may already be shifting. As the influence of the AES continues to grow, West Africa is also entering a new geopolitical competition involving outside powers searching for influence across the continent. Russia and Turkey have become two of the most important new partners for Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Unlike the older Western model of intervention, these relationships are often presented as more flexible and based on mutual strategic interests rather than political conditions. Russia has expanded military cooperation with several Sahel governments, through training, equipment support, and security partnerships. At the same time, Turkey has increased its presence through defense technology, military cooperation, and economic partnerships. For the AES leadership, these new alliances represent an opportunity to diversify partnerships and reduce dependence on traditional Western powers. However, this shift also raises serious questions. Some critics warn that replacing one foreign dependency with another cannot create true sovereignty. Others argue that African countries must avoid becoming battlegrounds for global power competition between East and West. At the same time, Western governments remain deeply concerned about the rise of the AES. Many fear that the growing popularity of military-led governments could weaken democratic institutions across Africa and inspire similar political movements elsewhere in the region. There are also concerns that continued instability may damage investment, economic growth, and humanitarian conditions. Still, many Africans respond with a different perspective. They argue that promises of democracy mean little when insecurity continues to destroy communities year after year. For them, the real struggle is not simply about elections or alliances. It is about restoring hope, security, and dignity to ordinary people. The future of West Africa may now depend on whether ECOWAS and the AES can find a way to cooperate despite their deep political differences. Terrorist groups do not respect borders, political systems, or regional organizations. As insecurity spreads across the Sahel and toward coastal nations, the pressure for coordination is becoming impossible to ignore. For many analysts, the recent dialogue between ECOWAS and the AES signals the beginning of a new political reality. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are no longer viewed only as isolated military governments under sanctions. They are increasingly being seen as a regional bloc with growing influence, military coordination, and ideological impact across Africa. At the same time, the challenges facing the AES remain enormous. Military operations alone cannot solve poverty, unemployment, weak infrastructure, or the humanitarian crisis affecting millions of people across the Sahel. Long-term stability will require not only security victories, but also economic development, education, and trust between governments and citizens. Still, one lesson has become impossible to ignore. Many Africans now believe that the continent must strengthen its own ability to defend its people, secure its borders, and shape its own political future without permanent dependence on outside powers. West Africa is entering one of the most dangerous and transformative moments in its modern history. The region now stands between two possible futures. One path leads deeper into division, terrorism, foreign manipulation, and endless instability. The other path could lead toward a stronger and more self-reliant Africa capable of defending its own people and controlling its own destiny. The unexpected meeting between ECOWAS and the AES revealed something very important. The political map of West Africa is changing, whether the old powers accept it or not. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have already become major actors shaping the future of the Sahel. Their alliance has forced difficult conversations about sovereignty, security, and the true meaning of African independence in the modern world. At the center of this transformation stands Captain Ibrahim Traore, whose rise has inspired both admiration and controversy across the continent. To many supporters of Pan-African ideals, Ibrahim Traore represents a new generation determined to protect African dignity against insecurity and foreign pressure. Others remain cautious, warning that military power alone cannot guarantee long-term prosperity or democratic stability. But one reality is clear. Millions of Africans are searching for new leadership models because too many old systems fail to deliver peace and security. The growing influence of the AES reflects not only military cooperation, but also a deeper emotional shift happening across Africa's new political consciousness. As the African Union, ACOWAS, and the Alliance of Sahel States navigate this uncertain future, the entire continent is watching closely. The struggle unfolding in Burkina Faso and across the Sahel is no longer only about territory or politics. It is about identity, sovereignty, and the future direction of Pan-Africanism itself. If you believe Africa deserves security, dignity, and sovereignty, subscribe to the channel and join us for more stories shaping the future of the continent. Just a few years ago, Burkina Faso was being described as one of the most dangerous places on Earth. International reports ranked it among the countries hardest hit by terrorism. Entire communities lived under constant fear. Armed groups expanded their influence across large parts of the country, and many analysts warned that the nation was moving toward collapse. At the time, headlines focused on growing insecurity, mass displacement, and the steady erosion of state authority. Millions of people were affected by the crisis. Schools closed their doors. Health centers stopped functioning. Families abandoned their homes, uncertain if they would ever return. For many observers, Burkina Faso appeared trapped in a downward spiral with no clear way out. What makes this story remarkable is what happened next. By 2025, international assessments began reporting something few expected. Burkina Faso recorded the largest reduction in terrorism-related deaths anywhere in the world. The same country that had become a symbol of insecurity was now being cited as an example of significant improvement in the fight against violent extremism. How did this happen? What changed inside a nation that many believed was already losing the battle? And why have the results forced even some of its harshest critics to pay attention? In this video, we will explore the crisis that pushed Burkina Faso to the edge, the leadership decisions that reshaped its security strategy, and the transformation that has turned one of the world's most troubled countries into a nation determined to reclaim its future. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy stories about Africa's transformation and the leaders reshaping its future. To understand the scale of this turnaround, we first need to return to the darkest years of Burkina Faso's crisis. Between 2019 and 2022, terrorist violence escalated dramatically. Large areas of the country became difficult to govern. Armed groups linked to regional extremist networks launched repeated attacks on villages, military positions, and transportation routes. Fear spread rapidly across the nation, and many international observers believed Burkina Faso was losing control of its own territory. When people discuss Burkina Faso's transformation, one name inevitably stands at the center of the conversation: Captain Ibrahim Traore. When he took power in 2022, many outside observers were skeptical. He was young, relatively unknown on the international stage, and inheriting a country facing one of the worst security crises in the world. Terrorist attacks were increasing, public confidence was falling, and large portions of the population had been displaced from their homes. For critics, the outlook seemed bleak. Many predicted that Burkina Faso would continue down the same path of instability that had already consumed so much of the Sahel region. But Traore chose a different approach. Rather than focusing primarily on international approval, he placed security at the center of his agenda. His message was straightforward. Burkina Faso could not depend entirely on outside powers to solve its problems. The country would need to strengthen its own institutions, rebuild its military capacity, and restore control over its territory through national effort. This philosophy became the foundation of a broader strategy built around sovereignty, self-reliance, and national mobilization. Supporters viewed this approach as a necessary response to years of worsening insecurity. They argued that previous methods had failed to stop the expansion of terrorist groups and that a new direction was needed. One of Traore's most important decisions was to treat the security crisis as a national challenge rather than a problem for the military alone. The government increased recruitment efforts, expanded local defense initiatives, and encouraged greater participation from communities affected by violence. At the same time, Burkina Faso began diversifying its international partnerships. Instead of relying on a single group of foreign partners, the country explored relationships with a wider range of nations willing to provide military, economic, and technical cooperation. Whether one agrees with all of Traore's policies or not, there is little doubt that his leadership marked a turning point. While many expected Burkina Faso to continue losing ground, the country began pursuing a strategy designed not merely to survive, but to reverse the trajectory of the conflict itself. The real test, however, would come on the battlefield, where strategy would have to be matched by results. If leadership provided the vision, military reform provided the mechanism that turned vision into action. One of the first priorities of Burkina Faso's new security strategy was rebuilding the country's ability to fight back. For years, terrorist groups had exploited vast distances, weak infrastructure, and limited military presence across large sections of the country. Security forces were often forced into a reactive posture, responding after attacks had already occurred. The new approach sought to change that reality. Recruitment efforts were expanded, bringing more personnel into the armed forces at a time when the security threat remained severe. Alongside the regular military, the government increased support for community-based defense initiatives and volunteer forces that could help improve local security and provide valuable intelligence. The goal was not simply to increase numbers. The objective was to create a broader national security network capable of responding more quickly to threats and maintaining a stronger presence in vulnerable regions. At the operational level, the military gradually shifted from defense to offense. Instead of focusing exclusively on protecting positions after attacks occurred, security forces launched more proactive operations aimed at disrupting extremist networks before they could strike. This strategy focused heavily on mobility, intelligence gathering, and territorial recovery. Areas that had long been considered difficult to secure became priorities for military operations. Supply routes received greater attention, while efforts were made to reconnect isolated communities with government services. The psychological impact was also significant. For years, terrorist organizations had benefited from the perception that they could move freely and operate without serious resistance. As military operations intensified, the message began to change. The state was no longer retreating. It was actively contesting territory and attempting to restore its authority. Success did not come overnight. The conflict remained complex, and serious security challenges persisted. However, the shift in strategy started producing visible changes on the ground. More communities began seeing a stronger security presence, and confidence gradually improved in areas where state authority had previously weakened. This military transformation laid the foundation for the next phase of Burkina Faso's security strategy, one that combined domestic reforms with new international partnerships and modern military capabilities. As Burkina Faso expanded its military operations, another important change was taking place behind the scenes. The country was working to modernize the tools available to its armed forces. For years, one of the biggest challenges facing security forces across the Sahel was mobility. Terrorist groups often operated across vast and difficult terrain, moving quickly between remote areas and exploiting gaps in security coverage. Fighting such networks required more than determination. It required modern equipment, capable of supporting rapid and effective operations. This is where Burkina Faso's growing defense partnerships became increasingly important. Among the systems attracting international attention were Chinese-made armored vehicles, advanced mortar platforms, and modern rocket systems. These acquisitions represented a significant upgrade in capability compared with much of the equipment previously available to the armed forces. The VN-22B armored vehicle offered improved protection and mobility for troops operating in high-risk areas, in regions where ambushes and roadside attacks had become common. Better protection could mean the difference between success and failure during an operation. The PLL-05 self-propelled mortar system provided greater flexibility and fire support. Its combination of mobility and precision made it suitable for responding quickly to threats while supporting troops engaged in difficult terrain. Meanwhile, the SR-5 rocket system brought longer-range strike capabilities that could be used against larger concentrations of hostile forces. Such systems gave commanders additional options when planning operations across wide geographic areas. However, it is important to understand what these weapons did and did not accomplish. Military equipment alone does not defeat terrorism. No armored vehicle, rocket launcher, or artillery system can solve underlying security challenges by itself. Success depends on leadership, training, intelligence, logistics, coordination, and the ability to maintain control over recovered territory. What the new equipment provided was an important advantage. It strengthened the military's ability to implement its broader strategy and increased its capacity to respond to evolving threats. Combined with expanded recruitment, territorial operations, and regional cooperation, modernization became another piece of the larger effort to reverse years of insecurity, and gradually, measurable results began to emerge. For any government, military operations are ultimately judged by results. Strategies, speeches, and equipment matter. But the real question is simple. Did conditions improve on the ground? By 2025, a growing number of observers were forced to acknowledge that something significant was happening in Burkina Faso. International assessments reported that the country experienced the largest reduction in terrorism-related deaths anywhere in the world during that year. This was especially remarkable because Burkina Faso had previously been considered one of the global epicenters of terrorist violence. The numbers alone attracted attention, but statistics tell only part of the story. Behind those figures were communities that had spent years living under constant fear. In several areas, residents began returning to places they had previously been forced to abandon. Families that had fled violence started rebuilding their lives. Economic activity slowly resumed in locations where insecurity had disrupted daily life for years. The return of civilians is often one of the clearest indicators that security conditions are changing. People rarely return home because of political speeches. They return when they believe the risks have become lower, and the future appears more stable than the past. There were also signs of progress in territorial control. Security forces increased their presence in areas that had once been considered highly vulnerable. Transportation routes became easier to secure, and local authorities gradually expanded their ability to provide services in some previously isolated communities. None of this meant that Burkina Faso had solved every problem. The country continued to face serious security threats, humanitarian challenges, and economic pressures. Extremist groups remained active in parts of the region, and the situation was still far from perfect. Yet the broader trend was difficult to ignore. Only a few years earlier, many analysts were asking whether Burkina Faso could survive its security crisis. By 2025, the conversation had changed dramatically. The focus was no longer on imminent collapse. Instead, attention shifted toward understanding how such a significant improvement had been achieved. The country's experience was becoming one of the most closely watched security stories anywhere in Africa, and perhaps in the world. As Burkina Faso's security situation began to improve, A debate emerged that extended far beyond the country's borders. For years, many Western governments, media organizations, and policy experts had expressed concerns about the direction taken by Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traore. Critics questioned the country's political trajectory, warned about the risks associated with military-led governance, and raised concerns about human rights, democratic institutions, and international partnerships. Some observers argued that distancing the country from traditional Western security frameworks would weaken its ability to combat terrorism. Others predicted that new alliances and alternative security strategies would fail to produce meaningful results. Yet the developments that followed complicated those predictions. The reality was not a simple story of total success or total failure. Burkina Faso continued to face serious challenges. Terrorist groups remained active in parts of the country. Humanitarian needs were still significant. Economic pressures had not disappeared. At the same time, measurable improvements in security forced many analysts to reconsider earlier assumptions. This raised an uncomfortable question. If previous approaches had been fully effective, why had terrorism expanded so dramatically before 2022? For many supporters of Burkina Faso's current strategy, this question lies at the heart of the debate. They argue that the country did not choose a new path out of ideology alone. It chose a new path because the old one was not producing the results citizens desperately needed. The emergence of regional cooperation through the Alliance of Sahel States further reinforced this perspective. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger increasingly emphasized local solutions to regional security challenges, seeking to build frameworks based on their own priorities rather than external expectations. The lesson may not be that one side was entirely right and the other entirely wrong. Instead, Burkina Faso's experience suggests that security strategies must ultimately be judged by outcomes. Political theories and international preferences matter, but citizens living under the threat of terrorism often care most about whether violence decreases and stability returns. That is why the story of Burkina Faso continues to attract global attention. It challenges assumptions, provokes debate, and forces observers to confront difficult questions about sovereignty, security, and the future of Africa's fight against extremism. The story of Burkina Faso is far from over. Challenges remain. Security threats have not disappeared. Economic pressures continue to test the country's resilience. Humanitarian needs still affect countless families, and no serious observer would claim that every problem has been solved. Yet focusing only on the difficulties would miss the larger significance of what has happened. Just a few years ago, Burkina Faso was widely portrayed as a country trapped in an endless cycle of violence. Many believed the state was losing control. Many predicted further decline. Some even questioned whether lasting stability was still possible. Today, the conversation is very different. The country that once symbolized the spread of terrorism in the Sahel is increasingly being discussed as a case study in security recovery. The country that many expected to fail has instead demonstrated that determined leadership, military reform, national mobilization, and strategic partnerships can alter the trajectory of a crisis. At the center of this transformation stands Ibrahim Traore, a leader who remains controversial to some and inspiring to others. Regardless of political opinion, his role in reshaping Burkina Faso's direction has become impossible to ignore. Perhaps the most important lesson extends beyond Burkina Faso itself. Across Africa, many nations continue searching for solutions to challenges involving security, development, and sovereignty. Burkina Faso's experience suggests that lasting progress often begins when countries develop the confidence to define their own priorities, strengthen their own institutions, and pursue strategies rooted in their own realities. Whether this model can be sustained over the long term remains one of the most important questions facing the region. What cannot be denied is that Burkina Faso has already changed the conversation. For supporters of Pan-African progress, the developments in Burkina Faso represent more than a national story. They symbolize a broader discussion about self-determination, regional cooperation, and the future direction of Africa's new leadership movements. From the vision promoted by Captain Ibrahim Traore to ongoing debates within the African Union, the themes of Pan-Africanism, sovereignty, and reform continue to shape the continent's future. And for many observers, the rise of Ibrahim Traore has become one of the defining political stories of modern Burkina Faso. If you believe Africa's future should be shaped by Africans themselves, share your thoughts below and subscribe for more in-depth stories about the continent's transformation. We will see you in the next video. What happens when fighter jets are striking targets across Gao, Kidal, Kayes, and Buguni, while, at the very same moment, a national leader chooses to travel through one of the most dangerous roads in the Sahel? That question is now being asked across West Africa after images emerged of Captain Ibrahim Traore traveling alongside troops on the Dédougou-Solenzo route, an area that has faced years of security threats, roadside explosives, and terrorist activity. At the same time, the Malian armed forces have intensified military operations across several strategic regions. Reports from the battlefield indicate precision strikes against militant positions, logistics hubs, weapon storage sites, and networks believed to support terrorist activities, from Gao in the east to Kidal in the north, from Kayes in the west to Buguni in the south. Mali appears determined to increase pressure on armed groups operating across the country. But this story is bigger than military operations alone. It is about leadership under pressure. It is about the changing security landscape of the Sahel. And it is about a growing message coming from the countries of the Alliance of Sahel States that they intend to confront security threats on their own terms. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you never miss important developments shaping the future of Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and the wider Sahel region. The first thing that stands out is the scale of Mali's recent operations. Instead of focusing on a single area, military pressure has reportedly been applied across multiple regions simultaneously. In Gao, security forces targeted locations believed to be linked to armed networks. In Kidal, continued surveillance and strike operations aimed to limit the movement of hostile elements. In Kayes, military attention focused on locations suspected of supporting retreat and resupply activities. Meanwhile, in Buguni, security forces disrupted an alleged attempt to place explosive devices along an important transportation corridor. Taken together, these operations reveal something important. Mali is no longer presenting these actions as isolated responses to attacks. The pattern suggests a broader strategy aimed at weakening the infrastructure that allows armed groups to operate, move, communicate, and sustain themselves across vast areas of territory. To understand why Mali has concentrated military pressure on Gao, Kidal, Kayes, and Buguni, it is necessary to look beyond the headlines and examine the strategic value of these locations. Gao has long been one of the most important cities in northern Mali. Positioned along major transportation routes, it serves as a gateway connecting different parts of the country. Control of Gao influences the movement of people, supplies, and security forces. For armed groups, access to areas around Gao can provide opportunities to move resources and maintain operational flexibility. For the state, maintaining control of Gao is essential for preserving national cohesion and projecting authority into remote regions. Kidal carries a different but equally significant importance. For years, the region has been associated with insurgent activity, armed movements, and difficult terrain that complicates security operations. Because of its location and history, Kidal has often been viewed as a symbolic and strategic center in the struggle for stability in northern Mali. Any effort to limit militant freedom of movement in this region carries both military and political significance. Further west lies Kayes, a region frequently described as an economic lifeline. Important commercial routes pass through the area, linking Mali with neighboring countries and international markets. Disruptions in Kayes can affect transportation, trade, fuel supplies, and economic activity far beyond the region itself. This makes security in Kayes a national concern rather than a purely local issue. In the south, Buguni occupies a key position along transportation corridors that support both civilian and military movement. Protecting these routes is critical because armed groups often target roads and infrastructure to create fear. Slow